If you live in Central or Eastern Europe, it's pretty clear to you that this simple scheme doesn't work. The principal victor in Europe during the Second World War was not the goodies with the white hats. It was Joseph Stalin, a totalitarian dictator who actually killed more people than Hitler did. And this system that was introduced in Poland in 1944 to 45 didn't resemble liberation one bit. In fact, I'm very reluctant to use the word liberation about what happened in the Second World War in Eastern Europe. What actually happened is that one murderous totalitarian system was driven out, namely the Third Reich, and another victorious totalitarian system was brought in, and we, the allies of Poland and the Americans, were far too weak to affect the outcome. Joseph Stalin was the principal victor of the Second World War in Europe. And this meant that Poland, which had not only suffered beyond description during the war, was visited by a second wave of oppression and indeed of murders, of physical violence after the war. And it took a considerable time for the communist system in Poland to quiet down, to move on from the killings of the Stalinist era to the somewhat milder dictatorship which followed. There were in fact three phases in post-war Poland. First, the Stalinist system, as imported in 1944 on the end of Soviet bayonets. Then after 1956, the equally doctrinaire communism of Gomulka, a communist, however, who, having seen some of the Soviet realities for himself, decided to use much milder methods than had been the case in the 1940s and the 1950s. And then after 1970, the phase of communism of Edward Gierek, who was a coal miner from the West, who's brought up in Belgium, and had a much milder and almost human approach to the problems of the country. And solidarity appears in 1980 as this communist system, still apparently very strong, is nonetheless moving into a period where forms of dissent and opposition could arise. The other thing I would say about the communist system, one ought to talk about it much more thoroughly, but time is short. It had two obvious weaknesses from the point of view of the subjects who were ruled by it. One was that it was extraordinarily negligent of the basic needs of people, the everyday needs of people. Supply of food, decent housing, decent services, not to mention consumerism, the things that were in the shops. The standard of living of the workers in the Soviet bloc was immeasurably lower than those in the so-called capitalist West. The Soviet system was very good at some things. It was very good at producing tanks in large numbers. It was very good in quantitative production, very bad in technology and, as I said, supplying people's essential needs. In the late 70s, as I can remember very well, Poland was undergoing food shortages. There was a period of several years where the average Polish citizen would have to stand in line for 3, 4, 5 hours to buy a loaf of bread. And as for things like petrol, I can remember queues of cars waiting to buy 20 litres of petrol on a ration card that were miles long. People in a queue would divide themselves into 10 cars, and they would each push the cart forward slowly. They would take rotors, and while their wives were queuing for bread, the men would be queuing for petrol to put just half a can of petrol in the tank. This is in the early years of motorization. So the basic supply of the population's needs was extremely feeble. The other thing, other weakness of the system which stands out is that the working class, the industrial working class, in whose interests the Soviet-style communist state was supposed to operate, had no say in its own government at all. The Soviet system was a party dictatorship, and the country was ruled by a clique, a self-appointed clique of people, party members, among whom the percentage of genuine industrial workers was actually falling rapidly. And I think it could have been predicted well in advance that when the crisis of this system came, the neuralgic point where the system was weakest of all, the workers' state was weakest, was that it didn't allow any basic freedom for the working class. There were trade unions in Poland, in communist Poland. All Soviet-style states had an elaborate trade union movement. And I'm sorry to say that the trade unions of this country were taken in and had, as it were, fraternal relations with these communist unions. But the communist-style unions operated as the wrong way around. They were simply conveyor belts for passing on the instructions of the party dictatorship to the population, not as trade unions are supposed to be representatives of the workers themselves. So, although there were trade unions, there was nothing that we in the West would recognize as a free trade union. And one can go on. There were elections throughout the communist system, but there were elections without choice because the party dictatorship decided who could be a candidate and who couldn't. So at the most there was the choice between one party-appointed candidate and another party-appointed candidate. There was no choice in elections, so elections were a misnomer. In 1970, this predicted crisis among the industrial working class broke out in the Baltic ports of Szczecin and Gdańsk and elsewhere in a typical workers' revolt, attempted strikes which were then put down by brute force, by the army being brought in, and I forget the numbers now, but certainly scores of workers were killed in Gdańsk, killed actually when they'd stopped striking, and one day when they were returning to work, the machine guns were turned on them and considerable numbers were killed. This was a horrific event, of course, not just for the population, but also for the party, because they realized, if they didn't know beforehand, that their pretense of being representatives of the workers was pretty flimsy. One of the demands in 1970 and among dissidents afterwards was a demand for free trade unions. The demands that the ruling party concede that there be genuine representation of the workers who could discuss, as they do the world over, pay, conditions of work. One of the people very much affected by the events of 1970 was a very young electrician called Lech Wałęsa, who was not among those that were killed or injured, but for whom the memory of his colleagues was extremely important and gave him, I think, the first motivation in his later surprising career. There was an underground free trades union movement with which Wałęsa at some point had a connection. And of course it was an underground movement in the 1970s which was mercilessly pursued by the communist police. Wałęsa was hauled in many times, questioned, beaten up, and this is a phase of his career which has recently led to some questions, but it's, I think, a very minor aspect of his curriculum vitae.